No man wanted the obese bride until he took her hand in front of everyone. But before that hand, can you imagine the pain of a 50-year-old woman, ridiculed, treated as a burden by her family, and made a joke by the whole town? How can she maintain her dignity when her whole life has been filled with rejections and contemptuous looks? And then what happened after that? Man dared to take her hand in front of everyone? Is late love strong enough to change the fate of someone who was once considered unworthy? The autumn air in Dry Creek carried the sharp tang of smoke and dust curling through the market square, where traders gathered to barter. Among the crates of apples, bolts of calico, and buckets of nails, there was something else that day, something that did not belong. It was Clara, 50 years old, broad-hipped, soft in the middle, with a face that had carried laughter once, but had learned too often to hide behind silence. She wore her mother's old shawl, patched 3 times over, and carried herself as if each step had been weighed and measured before she dared take it. The jeering started before she had even crossed the square. Ezra Pike, a trader known for his slick tongue and mean humor, slapped the side of a pen filled with squealing pigs and called out, "Well, boys, what do you think? Fair trade, isn't it? A pen of pigs for the obese bride." The laughter rippled, crude and careless. Boots scraped. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Clara felt the old sting rise in her chest, that deep, bone-heavy ache of being made a spectacle. But she did not bow her head. She did not beg. She simply adjusted the shawl around her shoulders and let her gaze fall, not on the crowd, but on the line of cottonwoods at the edge of town. The trees did not judge her. They only stood tall and indifferent, rustling their leaves, as if reminding her that wind and water carried no opinion of flesh. Inside, her words swelled. All the words she had never been allowed to speak in the years of rejection, the years of being told she was too much, too late, too large to ever be chosen. Yet she swallowed them again the way she always had. Silence had been her armor, even when it cut her tongue. One child, a boy with freckles, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why are they laughing at her?" The mother shushed him quickly, eyes darting away from Clara's face. That more than the laughter burned. Not the cruelty, but the avoidance. Clara walked on each step, echoing on the wooden boards, as though the ground itself wanted to remind her she was still here, still moving forward. She passed the pigs, past the jeers, and reached the small wooden bridge that crossed the narrow stream beyond the square. There she paused. The water glimmered beneath her, carrying the reflection of her broad shoulders, her rounded cheeks, her solemn eyes. The stream did not mock. It only moved steady and sure, shaping stone and soil with patient hands. She closed her eyes and breathed the chill of the air filling her lungs. They see me as a bargain, she thought, but the river does not. The river simply sees me. Her hands tightened on the shawl. She would not cry here, not before them. She had learned long ago that tears only fed the laughter of men like Ezra Pike. No, she would hold herself upright, though every bone in her body longed to fold into the earth. Behind her, the market buzzed on, forgetting her already. But something in the air shifted, quiet, almost imperceptible. Because though she could not see him yet, another pair of eyes had noticed, not with ridicule, but with recognition. A man who did not laugh. A man who did not look away. Thomas, a lifetime of being priced and dismissed. Can it all change with one quiet voice that chooses to see her differently? The market had begun to thin shadows stretching long across the square. Merchants packed their unsold wares into wagons, mothers gathered children by the hand, and the echo of Ezra Pike's laughter still lingered like a sour smell in the air. But in the quiet after, Clara felt it, a presence near the bridge, where she stood staring down at the stream as if the water might answer for her life. She turned, expecting another jeer, another smirk. Instead, it was Thomas. He was not a stranger to Dry Creek. Folks knew him as the widowed rancher who worked the northern fields, a man of few words, broad-shouldered, and steady, his hair already silver at the temples. He was the kind of man who spoke less than he listened, who did his work without fuss. Now he stood a few paces away, hat in his hand, eyes not mocking but solemn. "I reckon they've forgotten their manners," he said at last, his voice low, shaped by years of dust and distance. Clara tightened the shawl at her chest. "It's nothing new." He shook his head. "Doesn't make it right." The words were plain, almost clumsy, and yet to Clara they fell like rain on parched soil. For years she had endured silence or cruelty. Rarely had anyone spoken aloud that the shame was not hers to carry. They think it's a joke, she whispered more to herself than to him. Thomas's gaze steadied on her. You're not a bargain. You're a person. The breath caught in her throat. Simple words, yes, but heavy with something she had long been denied recognition. Not pity, not performance, but truth. I don't know why you'd trouble yourself to say so, she murmured, uncertain, waiting for the catch, the twist that always came when kindness was given with one hand and taken back with the other. Because it needed saying, Thomas replied. He looked toward the horizon where the sun sank behind the cottonwoods, washing the sky in bruised gold. And because silence lets men like Pike think they're right, I won't give them that. For a long moment the two stood together, the sound of the stream filling the silence between them. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and for the first time in longer than she could recall, Clara did not feel small. She felt seen. When at last she turned to leave, Thomas spoke again. My ranch is a mile north. If you need a place to rest, the door's open. Not charity, just a roof and a warm meal if you want it. Her instinct was to refuse. Pride was a thin shield, but it was hers. Yet something in his tone, quiet, unpressing, like an offered hand left open, made her hesitate. I'll think on it, she said softly. He tipped his hat. That's all I ask. That evening, Clara walked away from the bridge, her steps lighter than when she had crossed the square. She carried no promises, no illusions. Only a handful of words tucked deep inside like a lantern she hadn't realized she was still allowed to light. You're not a bargain. You're a person. Later, when she sat alone in the small rented room above the blacksmith's shop, she laid her shawl across her lap and let the words echo in her chest until they hummed like the steady current of the stream. Perhaps she thought there were still voices in this world that could change the sky. A voice can steady the shaking ground, but will it be enough when the storm of gossip rises stronger than ever? By the next morning, the whispers had already spread across Dry Creek, like wind through brittle grass. The tale was simple enough for gossip to devour the obese bride traded for pigs, standing on the bridge with the widowed rancher. Every tongue added its own twist. Some said Thomas had pitied her. Others said he had been desperate. A few muttered darkly that maybe he had been fooled, that no decent man would take her hand unless something was broken in him too. Clara heard it first at the general store. She had gone for flour, her shawl wrapped close, her chin set firm. But as soon as she stepped through the door, conversation faltered. That's her, someone whispered. She'll eat him out of house and home. Did you see the way he stood by her, fool man? Can't he see what she is? Each word landed sharp as gravel in her shoes. She pretended not to hear, pretended the row of shelves in front of her deserved every ounce of attention. She picked up the sack of flour with steady hands, though her heart trembled. When she turned toward the counter, the storekeeper, a kindly woman named Mrs. Halbert, looked at her with hesitant eyes. Not unkind, but not brave either. She rang up the flour without a word of defense, and that silence too cut. By the time Clara stepped back into the daylight, her breath was ragged. She made her way down the street, past the smithy, past the saloon. Everywhere she felt the weight of eyes, the smother of judgment. It was too much to bear again. Hadn't she spent her whole life in the shadow of such words? Too big, too plain, too late, and now even kindness would bring her shame. She stopped at the edge of town, fighting back tears. And that was when Thomas appeared. He had been delivering hay into town, his wagon creaking under the load. He saw the tightness in her jaw, the way her shoulders hunched beneath the shawl, and he climbed down slowly. What happened? He asked, his voice quiet. She shook her head, unwilling to give voice to their cruelty. They talk. He nodded once. They always will. The simplicity of it startled her. No outrage, no attempt to deny what she had heard. Just truth, plain and steady as the ground beneath their feet. They'll never let me forget, she whispered. His eyes met hers, firm as oak. Then let them remember the right thing. Not the pigs, not Pike's laughter. Let them remember you kept your head high, that you endured, that you didn't let them decide who you are. Something inside her quivered at his words. For years she had survived by silence, by enduring without answer. But here was a man who urged her not to vanish, not to shrink, to remain even in the face of scorn. I don't know if I can, she admitted. You already have, Thomas replied. Yesterday, today, and you'll keep on. The firmness in his tone was not commanding, not demanding. It was belief placed gently in her hands like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. For the first time that day, Clara let herself breathe deeply. The shame did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. And that was enough to take one more step forward. That evening, she stood again by the stream, watching the water slip past, carrying whispers away into distance. Perhaps she thought the town could speak as it pleased. The river still moved, and she still stood. When a whole town's voice rises against her, can one man's steady belief keep Clara from breaking, or will silence claim her again? Days passed and the whispers did not fade. They clung to the air of Dry Creek like the smell of smoke after a fire. Some laughed openly when Clara walked through town. Others lowered their voices but sharpened their eyes, letting her feel the sting without a word. For years she had borne such things by stepping aside, by making herself smaller than she was. But something had begun to shift. Each time Thomas spoke to her, each time he looked at her without flinching, she felt a strange strength press against the cage of her silence. It came to its breaking point on a Sunday morning. The church bell rang slow and solemn, calling the town to gather. Families filled the wooden pews, children tugging at skirts, men removing their hats. Clara hesitated at the door, knowing what waited for her inside the whispers. The turned heads, the reminder that she did not belong. But Thomas was there. He met her at the steps, his hat in his hand, his voice calm. "Walk in with me." She froze. "They'll talk." "They already do," he said. "Let them see you stand." His hand extended, not pushing, not pulling, only waiting. And something inside her, weary of shrinking, weary of shame, answered. Slowly she placed her hand in his. The hush that fell over the congregation as they stepped inside together was sharper than any jeer. The room filled with the scrape of shoes, the shuffle of breath. People turned, stared. But Clara did not look down. She held her shawl close, her shoulders square, and walked forward beside Thomas until they took their seats. It was a small act, yet in her chest it felt like thunder. For the first time in decades she had not hidden. She had not taken the back pew alone, had not slipped in after the hymns had begun. She had entered openly, and beside her sat a man who made no attempt to disguise his choice. After the service, the whispers grew louder. "Did you see her right beside him?" As if she belongs there. But one voice, softer and surprise, broke through. "Maybe she does." That night back at her small room, Clara laid aside her shawl and touched her face in the mirror. The same lines, the same softness, the same body she had carried all these years. And yet something was different, not in the reflection, but in her eyes. She was no longer only the woman who had been traded for pigs, the one mocked and dismissed. She was the woman who had stood beside Thomas without apology, and that she realized was its own kind of freedom. She whispered into the quiet, "I am still here." The words lingered warm and steady, as if the very walls were listening. To sit openly beside him was to claim a piece of dignity long denied. But would this bold step invite healing, or ignite the town's cruelty into something worse? For a little while, courage felt like its own shield. After that Sunday, Clara walked differently through Dry Creek. The stairs still followed, the whispers still stirred, but her steps no longer faltered. She carried herself as though she had a right to be seen, because she did. But courage also invited questions. One evening, as she left the store with a basket of beans and flour, a voice stopped her. Clara Whitmore. She froze. The name she had not spoken aloud in years. Slowly she turned. An older woman stood in the street, bonnet tied, neat eyes sharp with recognition. "It is you," I thought. "I thought you'd gone east." Memories swelled, unwelcome and bitter. Clara remembered the woman now, Mrs. Keaton from the neighboring farm of her youth. A woman who had seen everything, who had whispered along with the rest when Clara's father, in desperation, had traded her dowry for a pen of pigs. Mrs. Keaton's gaze lingered. "We all heard what happened after. That you married Pike for a season. That he left you. Folks said—" She trailed off, but the silence carried the weight of the rumor. Clara felt her hands tighten on the basket. The past was rising again, piece by piece, like bones unearthed after a storm. That night, sitting in the small kitchen of Thomas's ranch, she told him the truth. She told him about the bargain her father had made when the debts grew heavy, how she had been bartered as though her life were a commodity. She told him about Pike, the man who had taken her for a brief, bitter marriage only to discard her when she could not bear him a child. She told him about the years after living in the margins, enduring whispers that painted her not as a survivor, but as a failure. Through it all, Thomas said nothing. He sat with his elbows resting on the table, his hands folded, his eyes steady. When at last her voice faltered, she braced herself for judgment, for pity, for that faint edge of disgust she had come to expect. Instead, he said quietly, "You carried all that alone." Tears stung her eyes. She nodded. He leaned forward, then his voice rough but sure. "Clara, you weren't the shame. You were the price. And no one should have had to pay what you did." The words struck deep because they were the opposite of what she had always believed. All her life she had carried the weight as though it were hers to bear, as though her worth had been measured and found lacking. Yet here was a man telling her she had been worthy all along, and it was the world that had failed her. For a long time she wept, not with despair, but with the aching release of something long held tight. And when the tears slowed, Thomas reached across the table and placed his weathered hand gently over hers. "You're not what they called you, not what they traded. You're Clara, and that's enough." In the quiet that followed, she felt a new kind of strength settle inside her. Not the strength of hiding, not the strength of enduring, but the strength of being known. The past was no longer hers alone. Now that her past is laid bare, will Dry Creek use it to wound her again, or will Clara finally discover that shared truth can become shared strength? It was bound to come to a head. A town like Dry Creek never let a story lie quiet for long. The confrontation came on a Friday evening when lanterns burned low in the saloon and tempers rode high on whiskey. Thomas had gone into town to trade lumber for seed. Clara, wanting to prove her place beside him, had chosen to go with him. Together they walked the main street steady side by side. That's when Pike appeared. He had aged, but not kindly. His shoulders still broad, his mouth still sharp, but his eyes held the emptiness of a man who had wasted too many years. He stepped into the dirt street and called out, "Well, if it isn't my old Sal." The words cracked across the street like a whip. Conversation stilled. Men turned. Women drew sharp breaths. Clara froze, the insult burning her ears, dragging her backward into years she thought she had finally escaped. But before she could retreat, Thomas stepped forward. His voice was calm but iron-threaded every syllable. "You'll not speak to her like that," Pike sneered. "She's mine by right. Everyone knows it. Ain't that what the papers said?" He spat into the dust. "You think holding her hand makes her less of what she is?" The crowd stirred, eager for spectacle. For the first time, Clara felt the old urge to shrink, to vanish. But beside her, Thomas did not move. His stance was steady, protective, but not ashamed. He turned to her, not the crowd, not Pike, and said gently, "Clara, do you want to answer him?" The question startled her. No man had ever asked if she wanted to speak. No one had ever offered her the dignity of voice. Her heart pounded, her mouth dry. She lifted her chin. "I was never yours," she said to Pike, her voice trembling, but clear. "Not by choice, not by love, and I will not be your shame anymore." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Pike laughed, but the sound was hollow. You hear that? He shouted. "She's still the fat girl who thinks she's better than her betters?" But something had shifted. The crowd did not laugh with him. A few looked away uncomfortable. Others frowned, uneasy at the cruelty. Thomas spoke, then his tone steady, low enough to quiet the air. "She's worth more than you ever knew how to see. And if you call yourself a man, you'll walk away now." For a long moment it seemed Pike might lash out, but the silence of the crowd pressed against him. No one echoed his laughter. No one joined his cruelty. Alone in his venom, Pike spat again, then turned on his heel and disappeared into the saloon. The square exhaled. A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk, not jeers this time, not mockery, but something softer. Respect, perhaps, or the beginnings of it. Clara's hands shook, but she did not collapse. She stood. She had spoken. She had chosen to face the shadows of her past in front of every eye that once scorned her. And beside her, Thomas stood like the rooted oak, his presence saying without words, "You are not alone." That night as they returned to the ranch, the prairie wind felt different on her face. Not lighter, not yet, but freer. After facing her past in the middle of town, will Clara's courage finally open the door to healing? Or will the scars of humiliation linger? The days after that night in Dry Creek felt different. It wasn't as though the town had suddenly turned warm. Whispers still trailed in corners, but something had broken in the air, like a window opened in a stifled room. People no longer laughed in her face. Some nodded politely. A few even offered small kindnesses. But it was not the town that had changed most. It was Clara. For the first time in half a lifetime, she did not shrink from her own reflection. Each morning, as the dawn spread pale over the plains, she tied her shawl not like a shield, but like a garment she chose. She began humming while she baked. She even let herself laugh soft, unsure at first, but real. One evening, Thomas brought her out to the edge of his land, where the wheat met the wide horizon. The sun was sinking gold spilling across the fields like fire turned gentle. He carried something in his hand wrapped in cloth. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, his voice quiet. She frowned, curious, as he unwrapped it. Inside lay a simple silver band, tarnished but polished carefully. It was not new, it was not grand, but it gleamed with the weight of sincerity. Her breath caught. Thomas. He looked at her steadily, not with the hunger of a man eager to possess, but with the tenderness of someone offering a choice. "You've been told your worth lies in what others see. I don't see it that way. Clara, you're the strongest woman I've known. I don't need a beauty queen. I don't need a bride out of a catalog. I just need you." Tears welled in her eyes. For so long she had lived as though she were a burden to be bartered, a shadow to be mocked. And now here was a man telling her she was wanted freely, deliberately, wholly. Her voice trembled. "Do you know how long I've waited to hear words like that?" He reached for her hand, warm and steady. "Then let's not waste another day." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit imperfectly but beautifully, as though it had been waiting for her hand all along. That night, as they walked back to the house side by side, Clara looked up at the sky. The stars glimmered like scattered hope across the velvet dark, each one a small light that had waited through the years to be seen. She realized her story was no longer one of shame. It was one of survival, of dignity, reclaimed, of love found not in youth, but in the ripening of years. Weeks later at Sunday service, she and Thomas walked in again, hand in hand. This time the hush was softer. Someone smiled. Someone else whispered, not with mockery, but with something that sounded almost like respect. And Clara, with her chin lifted, her shoulders square, thought, this is what it feels like to belong. Her past had not vanished. The scars would always remain. But scars, she realized, were proof of healing, not of shame. As she stood beside Thomas, she whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for perfection, but for the grace of a love that had arrived late and true and strong enough to hold her whole. In that moment, the years of ridicule seemed far away, as distant as thunder beyond the hills. What remained was hope, and it was enough. Once traded like livestock, Clara now walked freely, as a woman loved for who she was. But could her story inspire others, those still waiting in silence, to believe that love might come for them too? Perhaps what makes us cry is not just the scene of Clara being despised by the whole town, but the quiet resilience of a woman who has spent her whole life being rejected. And perhaps what makes us smile at the end is when Thomas did not look at her, figure did not listen to the gossip, but quietly held her hand in front of the crowd and said, "You're worth more than gold." That story reminds us that sometimes the most precious thing in life does not come from the compliments or the appearance that others demand, but from having someone who sees us for who we really are. And that is enough to change everything. In life, each of us may have felt that we are too late, too much, or not enough. But remember, there are always hands ready to hold us. Late but complete, silent but strong. And who knows, that is the most lasting love. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to None. Wild West Saga. Share it with someone you think needs a gentle reminder. And I want to hear from you. Do you want to see a sequel to this journey? Or are you looking forward to more stories like this? Of late love, of healing, of hope that never fades? Leave a comment, because every word you write really matters.